All right, team, it has been a minute, but alas, here we are. We're going to cover how to actually build a character in Path of Exile, and all the fundamental building blocks, at least from my perspective, and the things you need to know to get a character off the ground. First and foremost, the best starting place for building a character, in my opinion, is the skill. What does the skill feel like? How does it play? What does it do? I generally start here. You could start with the Ascendancy or something along those lines, but I think that the skill gems are kind of the most important part because they will obviously determine everything else. You could also start with archetype too, like this character that you're looking at, he started as a shotgunner guy, and I kind of just want to run in and shoot shit with the crossbow as like a shotgun. And I started with fragmentation rounds, but as it turns out, physical damage and bleed damage sucks so much ass it could pull my brain through my butthole, so I skipped all that and now we're here. And the other thing to understand about the skill is that it determines what kind of character you will have in terms of what content it will be able to do. So do you have a clearing character that's going to blast maps? Do you have a single target character? Do you have an all-rounder? That sort of thing. That is a huge consideration because depending on how you want to play, some skills will probably just be straight up off limits. My general rule of thumb is that I will not consider a build until I have watched it showcased within a map. You must look at how builds map. It's probably the most important part of a build because the reality of it is you're going to spend 95% of your time in the game running maps. If you watch a map showcase and it doesn't seem like it's for you, you should probably skip over that build. To give an example of this, in PoE 1, I'm a Jug player till I die. It's pretty much the only thing I play anymore. I love that class to the death. And when I saw the Titan gameplay in a map or in the campaign, it was an immediate pass. There's no shot I could live my life being that slow the whole fucking time. And judging from the unbridled rage and infinite hatred from the comments in my last video, I'd say it's a pretty good fucking thing to watch the mapping showcase. Generally speaking, skills are also going to determine the ascendancy that you're going to play. Now, this isn't always the case, and there are, of course, exceptions. You can run multiple ascendancies for a single skill, depending on how you want to play it. But usually, ascendancies will have some sort of deterministic gating in terms of what you can actually play, given the skill or archetype, if you want to go that route, that you want to actually use. While it's not always the case, because of course it depends, generally speaking, your ascendancy is going to be about as important as the skill you choose, if not equally as important. And this is because your ascendancy is where you're going to get a bunch of unique and usually niche character power that does not have a source from any other aspect of the character, meaning that you cannot gain this from gear or gems or passive tree. It must be acquired through the ascendancy alone. Whenever I'm looking at an ascendancy, the four things I try to consider are: what are the damage layers, if there are any? What are the defensive layers, if there are any? What is the scaling? How am I going to scale either of those layers if they are present? And usually, what is the utility? Now, a quick note on utility, it is not really prevalent in PoE 2. It's kind of few and far between, especially from an ascendancy perspective. But I would consider things like the colossal capacity of the Titan, the movement speed from Ranger. I would consider those things utility. And lastly, there is a fifth thing. I wouldn't consider it basic, though. It's a bit more advanced, which is interactions. Interactions can be super simple, or they can be unbelievably complex, and they can range from giving your character insane amounts of character power to just a little bit of quality of life here and there. They're highly variable, and I'll get into them later. But to give you a quick example, I'll mention Slayer Overleach from PoE 1. What Overleach did from Slayer is that it meant your character did not lose leeching effects despite filling unreserved life. This meant that any modifier or passive that had while leeching on it became instantly more valuable because it no longer was conditional, it was now pseudo-permanent, and it improved the power of those passives. Going back to scaling, scaling is more of a subgrouping of damage and defense, and it's how the ascendancy scales will usually dictate a major building mechanic of it. So for example, the way that Stormweaver scales is by mana, so that means we're going to be stacking a ton of mana, and it dictates a lot of how you gear and where you go and how you path, that sort of thing. When it comes to damage and defensive layers and ascendancies, they usually tend to lean one way or the other. So if they have a lot of damage, they probably don't offer a lot of defense. And if they have a lot of defense, they probably don't offer a lot of damage. I think most of the ones in PoE 2 are like somewhere in between. But usually speaking, your ascendancy will generally solve for one problem. In the case of Witchhunter, it'll not solve for anything because that essentially actually sucks dick. But if we look at Stormweaver, it will usually solve, well, that will actually solve for everything because it's super fucking busted. If we look at something like Blood Mage, That solves for nothing because it sucks dick. Look, the point is that your Ascendancy will generally solve for a few things unless it's Witchhunter, which will solve for absolutely fucking nothing. And then you will have to fix everything else with your gear, your passives, and your skills. There's a general exchange that goes on. If I go full damage for my Ascendancy, I'm probably not getting a lot of defensives. And if I go full defense for my Ascendancy, I'm probably not getting a lot of damage. Before we move on, I'll mention this briefly. When I build a character, I'm generally trying to build a well-rounded character that can do mostly everything. I don't really like the super squish, rarity only, lightning arrow, everything off screen characters, and I do not like the hyper tank, wet noodle, can't kill, fuck all, and I sure as fuck do not pick minion builds. So my general approach is to aim for something that's like an all-rounder usually. With that being said, I wanted to go over how I determined that I was going to play Stormweaver before the game actually launched, and this was the exact thought process that I had when I was picking my character. I knew I was going to pick Arc, so I knew I would need to pick a caster, and let's start with Blood Witch. To be honest, Blood Witch was just never on the table because there were so many problems with this Ascendancy. Starting with Sanguimancy, literally half of it is a fucking descension, okay? You literally become worse when you pick this in this regard. Now, obviously, it's offset by life remnants, which I'm sure are pretty good or okay or whatever. But in my opinion, when I was looking at this, it was just like a giant pass. Like if you get all your life up and then you take a big fat hit, you now no longer have this Ascendancy point that you are forced to take, which sucks ass. Looking at things like Vitality Siphon, Open Swords, and Blood Barbs, none of this was like that interesting. Cursed Infinite Duration is like a big who gives a fuck. I didn't know about spell damage. Maybe this is OP, maybe it wasn't. Bleed, Lamau. Looking at Gore Spike, I know a lot of people were super stoked about it, but honestly, when I read this, the only thing I could think of was, wow, you have to have 4,000 life to get 100% crit multi. That seems like quite the task, especially given the fact that they removed life from the tree. This seemed like something that would take forever to fucking scale. With this being your second Ascendancy at best, then the problem is that you're so anti-front loaded, like you just don't have anything from your Ascendancy for like the first fucking 2 times you do it when you play Blood Witch, so I was kind of pretty skeptical of the early game of this. Sunder Flesh actually seems super good. 15% base crit is really high. Obviously, Progenesis from Grasping Wounds is extremely good as a defensive layer, and then Crimson Power converts your ES on body armor to maximum life, which actually seems very good as well, except the fucking problem is you have to take this first 2-point dog shit to play your dumbass little mini game where you run around collecting a bunch of bullshit, and you can't actually fucking pick 5, 6, and 7, and 8, so it sucks ass. So fuck Blood Witch. Moving on to Chayula Monk, and keep in mind, these were my thoughts when the game hadn't even released yet, so take it with a grain of salt. Although I will say, looking back at Chayula Monk, still, what a pile of shit Ascendancy. Holy fuck. It's poor man CI, Mana Leech like anyone gives a fuck. Reality Rending is actually in PoE 1 and it's still not very good. Into the Breach, this whole minigame thing, giant pass. Embrace the Darkness and Grasp the Void. These two things are actually so terrible that I modeled an entire part of the video around these Ascendancies. But before I get into that, let me provide you with a disclaimer. If there is anything as true as the sun rises, there are 2 things in PoE that will always be. First and foremost, 100 people could read the exact same line and have 101 different interpretations of how good or bad it is or what the fuck it even means. Secondly, in PoE, one man's trash is most certainly another man's treasure. Just because I think this is bad doesn't mean that it actually is. I'm sure someone somewhere, Jung Roan, Ben, anyone has made Chayula Monk god tier. It happens with literally everything. This was just my general perspective for what I was capable of doing, and reading Embrace the Darkness and Grasp the Void, I actually am not a rocket scientist, so there's no shot I could make this not trash. For most normal people and regular build makers, Embrace the Darkness and Grasp the Void represent 2 really important concepts when it comes to building a character, just in a negative way. The first being what is the power per point expenditure, and the second being conditional power. When we're talking about power per point expenditure, we're talking about how much power did I gain over the amount of points that I spent to gain it. In this case, we're spending Ascendancy points, so we're expecting this to be quite high. We're expecting it a lot for the usage of 4 Ascendancy points. But the reality of it is that assuming that Spirit removed means that you cannot have auras and auras won't work with darkness, what you gain, I was almost said lose, what you gain, quote unquote, for 4 Ascendancy points is that you lose Spirit, so you lose the ability to have auras, and then at the absolute best case scenario, when you are level 100, you gain 30% of your damage as extra chaos damage. So to put this in summary, We blew half of our Ascendancy to get rid of auras and gain like 25-ish% of extra damage as chaos. Fantastic. To put this in the perspective of power per point expenditure and compare, for Stormweaver, they spend 2 Ascendancy points to get Strike Twice. Strike Twice just effectively doubles your shock. Whatever your shock value is on the target, you get another shock of equal value. In this case, for 2 Ascendancy points on my Stormweaver, this is 84% more damage. 84% more damage onto the target for 2 Ascendancy points. Meanwhile, Purple fucking idiot over here is blowing 4 to get rid of his auras and gain 30% of damage as extra chaos damage by the time he rerolls his character. And then on top of that, it brings me to the second problem, or the second concept, which is that his power, quote unquote, is conditional. Now, conditionality doesn't necessarily mean that something is good or bad. It depends on the uptime of the condition. If my uptime is never and it's always down, it is like you simply do not ever have it. It just doesn't even exist. So it really depends on the conditional. Given the Chayula Monk, I don't know if you guys have read this, but your maximum darkness is 600. For each life or energy shield lost to damage, reserve 1 darkness instead if possible. Darkness reservation lasts for 10 seconds. So you mean to tell me for half of my Ascendancy, I gain at most 30% of damage as chaos. By the time I've rerolled my 4th fucking character, I lose my auras, and if I take 600 damage, it's all just gone, and I have nothing? I take 600 damage bumping into a fucking tree. This has 0 uptime. It would be down forever. Meanwhile, the Stormweaver, through Strike Twice, has 84%, 90%, scaling percent more damage with 100% uptime for 2 Ascendancy points. Literally, the moment you deal shock damage to something, it's just an instant double shock. This is the actual difference between Taylor Swift and your fucking local SoundCloud rapper, where this bitch is out on the stage fucking making millions, and the Chayula Monk is fucking making raps offbeat about a build he can't make. Anyways, the point of all this is that whenever you are looking at passives or Ascendancy points and you're trying to consider different forms or different paths for character power, you should always consider what is the total amount of power I gain over the amount of points that I spend, otherwise known as power per point. And then you should always look at if they are conditional or not. And more so when they're conditional, what is the uptime of the condition? If the uptime is good, the condition's fine, but uptime is really kind of the most important point. Moving on, when I was looking at Chronomancer, I just saw a lot of utility. There's a lot of niche things that might be super good here and there with a lot of different interactions. Overall, this is just kind of not for me. When I pick an Ascendancy, I tend to go for damage mostly, and especially if it has some way to scale it. For Deadeye, I didn't even look at this because I wanted to play a caster. I knew I was going to be playing Arc, and also I knew it was good because Fubgun said so. Gemling Legionnaire looked like it was going to be absolutely insane, but also there was just kind of a lot of thinky-winky on this guy, so that's a big pass. Infernalist was actually my second choice. I really liked Altered Flesh. Anytime I see Fizz taken as, I immediately get rock hard. It's one of my favorite defensive layers. I thought Loyal Hellhound looked pretty good too. I understand in game now it's like kind of shit and it just dies all the time. And then I thought, oh, it'd be kind of cool. You can use Demon Form with Master Darkness, and that will kind of give you your damage spiking. But I didn't realize at the time, or rather, once I learned that this gets rid of your main hand weapon, this just like obviously is just not good enough. And I'll make a point here too on Demon Form. You only have so many sources of stats for your character, and losing one of them is kind of a huge deal. Now, don't get me wrong, Demon Form, well, not at Master 10 Demon Flame, but assuming that I was going to take 10 Demon Flame, you're losing half of your Ascendancy for this form that is going to be a minute before you can keep 100% uptime on. And on top of that, you lose out on your main hand and offhand weapon slots while you're in this form. It's like the prospect of how much you lose, again, that power per point. So for half my Ascendancy, I get a pretty cool form, but I also am using half of my Ascendancy, and on top of that, I'm losing one of the most important damage slots, or I think the most important damage slot in the game for a character. Comparing that to a Stormweaver, for half of their Ascendancy, they gain Arcane Surge, which is more cast speed and mana regeneration, and then they gain the ability to scale it using mana outside of the Ascendancy. And this is all at a 100% uptime. It's constantly active, and there are literally no downsides to this. Of course, I didn't even consider Invoker because I was making a caster. Looking at Pathfinder, I know Pathfinders can do a lot, at least in PoE 1, but honestly, looking at Enduring Elixirs, I despise pressing my life flask at like a rate. You know what I mean? Like, okay, it's like every 6.5 seconds. I played Pathfinder like once or twice in PoE 1. I do not like this mechanic. This is more of a gameplay problem, and that's why I didn't even consider this. Obviously, I refuse to consider the warrior in any capacity, but finally, let's talk about the Witchhunter actually. So I considered the Witchhunter a lot, and I was actually going to go Witchhunter before they released the Stormweaver Ascendancy, and I was like, oh shit, this is obviously going to be insanely fucking broken. But the more I read over this Ascendancy, the more I kind of became more and more skeptical of it, and I will say I have a Witchhunter now, and he's my favorite character by far, but when I was initially looking at this, looking at something like Culling Strike, the fact that it applies before is so fucking lame. And then on top of that, looking at something like Decimating Strike, where, you know, it's the 5 to 30%, so on average, like 22.5, whatever the math is. The problem I have with this Ascendancy, particularly these 2 points right here, is it once again comes back to conditionality in a way. It's not that it's conditional, but rather it has to do with uptime. So for example, it's more of a gamble, right? If I come into a boss and I Decimating Strike him for 5%, and my Cull is just 5% on uniques, for 90% of that boss fight, I am 1/2 of an Ascendancy. Assuming that I only have 3 Ascendancies done because the 4th is pure AIDS, and I have Zealous Inquisition as my 3rd, when I go into that boss fight and I hit that 5 on Decimating Strike, I unironically am unascended, aside from my small passive points. So just considering the potential uptime problems, again, this isn't so much a conditional thing as it more is like, it's just a gamble on what your Ascendancy actually fucking does. But considering all of that and the uptime on that power and the potential to literally be Ascendancy naked when fighting a boss apart from 10% of the boss's health was just a giant no thanks for me. Although I will say I absolutely love this character now, far more than my boring ass Stormweaver who just one-shots everything. Now, obviously, I went with Stormweaver after all that, and again, that was just to give you kind of an idea of how I went about choosing an Ascendancy. The next thing I wanted to talk about, which is an unfortunate topic, is meta. Now, obviously, everyone hates meta, and we don't want there to be a meta, and I'm not even saying there is one. I don't think there's a meta right now, and even if there was, it would change probably within the week, especially within the month, right? It's early access, and it's just PoE in general. It's going to happen all the time. But I wanted to bring this discussion up because it's important to recognize that this is a concept that exists, and not that it's a concept that exists that we understand what's the best, but rather it is the concept that there are things that are good and things that are bad. And I'm not telling you to pick only the good things and avoid the bad things or vice versa. I simply want to point this out as a reality, which is that the game is going to be unbalanced. Probably forever, realistically speaking. I mean, PoE 1 has been out for 12 years. Phenomenal game, horribly unbalanced. Granted, it's gotten so much better, right? And they're improving. But the fact of the matter is, it is still unbalanced after 12 years. And I don't think anyone anticipated how unbalanced PoE 2 would be on its release and how crazy it is right now. But if that is any sort of indicator to you for the future, it is that it is always going to be imbalanced in some way, shape, or form. Now, once again, pick whatever you want, do whatever you want, but just understand that where you are on this spectrum of things that are total dog shit to things that are extremely good, like Stormweaver versus Chayula Monk, it will have a drastic impact on the experience that you have in the game. I know this because obviously I played PoE 1, and anyone who's played PoE 1 has played an off-meta skill versus a meta skill, and it's literally night and day. And then also in PoE 2, I played my Arc Stormweaver, which was the ultimate dick in hand simulator, and then I played my Witchhunter, where I actually had to like roll and play the game, and it was honestly, it was great. Actually, so much better. And the differences between those experiences are exactly why I'm talking about this to you right now. Obviously, I don't think everyone should be a meta slave, and ideally we wouldn't have to be. But the fact of the matter is, we're talking about building a character, and we're talking about building a skill and an ascendancy. You should consider where the skill and the ascendancy align themselves on this spectrum. Because again, they will determine radically the experience that you have. And some players, they want it to just get served the milk, hold Spark down until they wake up. And other players just are masochistic, fucking gritting their teeth the whole way, white knuckling their keyboard, playing warrior through the fucking campaign. And you should understand what experience you, between those two things, you would like to have. With all that in mind, let's talk about the first concept of building, actually building a character in game, which is damage. Across all concepts of building a character, the idea of layering is going to be something that I reference a lot, and it's going to be ubiquitous with literally everything. When we are trying to scale a character's damage, what we are looking for usually is going to be layers, and ideally layers that are both incidental to one another or close in proximity. When I talk about layering for damage, what I'm talking about is things that we take to make our damage go up. So in this case, we're talking about shock magnitude increases my shock value, which is more damage per 1% increase of shock value. We have cast speed, that's just more spells coming out faster. Exposure, resistance, penetration, lightning damage, spell damage. Chain is another way we layer with arc. And then we have Archmage as well. All of these are damage layers. All of these stack on top of each other to produce more damage from my character. When I talk about layers being incidental, I'm talking about layers occurring because another layer is occurring. So for example, shock magnitude. Because I'm using lightning damage and I'm scaling lightning damage with Archmage, I am just by product of using that damage type, am going to gain shock value. Shock value increases your damage against the target as a more multiplier, depending on whatever the percentage is on the target for the value of shock. So if I have 80% shock, it's 80% more damage, and that's the last time I'm going to fucking explain this. But that would be an example of an incidental layer. It's just kind of occurring, and because it's kind of occurring, there's maybe we should look into it and maybe it might be of value. To give an example of a defensive incidental layer would be something like the Everlasting Gaze. Well, because I'm going to be stacking mana anyway, and I'm going to have just as much mana pool as I possibly can have, and I'm converting all my ES to Eldritch Battery, because this item exists and the way that it interacts with Eldritch Battery, it allows me to retain a giant ES pool, essentially the size of my mana pool, while not actually having any base ES to use because it's converting it from this amulet. This would be more of an example of an interaction, but it is pretty much incidental to mana. I mean, you literally just put it on, like, oh, I want some ES, like, boom. It's just right there. And that's kind of why incidental things are really useful, or incidental layers are good, is because they usually require not a whole lot of investment to just get an extra free layer for either damage or defense. When I talk about damage layers being close in proximity, what I mean is that they're close to a connection on your tree, or they are close to your starting point and available through not so many travel points. Remember that ascendancy problem where we're talking about your power per point expended? This is kind of the exact same thing. It's passive point efficiency. So if I travel all the way over, let's say this crit node gives me like 100% more damage. It's that important. But if I have to spend 100 points to get to it, well, then it's only 1% increased damage per point. Whereas maybe this node over here really actually isn't that much more damage. Maybe it's only like 40% more damage, but we'll just pretend I only have to spend 4 points to get here. My power per point efficiency is at 10% damage per point expended. So even though this is less value, because of its proximity, it actually is more efficient and a better layer to go for in terms of damage. You will notice that I am freely interchanging layer and node, and that's because they are very closely related while still being slightly different. So if I have this node right here, exploit the elements, raw power, and practice signs, I'm looking at 3 nodes, but I only have 2 damage layers. And that's because anything that's just raw damage or base damage, like spell damage, not base damage, but just straight up increased damage of some kind. So spell damage, lightning damage, just damage straight up, and elemental damage. All of those nodes, provided that the magnitude is equivalent, they all kind of do the same amount of output in terms of increasing your character's damage. Whereas if I look at cast speed versus spell damage, if this was 20% cast speed and this was 20% spell damage, this node is way more valuable because cast speed as a layer has a much higher weighting for increasing your character's power relative to something like just base increased damage. Understanding the damage layer hierarchy for your character is crucial for maximizing damage, and just understanding the damage hierarchy in general, because it's relatively similar for a lot of characters, but it is build specific in many, many cases. For example, let's pretend these 3 travel nodes aren't here. These 4 nodes only equate to 50% increased magnitude of shock, meaning that they add 10% total shock value to my target, meaning that I'm only getting 10% more damage from these nodes. So they're actually only 2.5% increased damage, or 2.5% more damage. However, because I have strike twice and I'm a Stormweaver, these values are actually doubled because I apply shock twice. So it's actually 5% more damage per point as opposed to 2.5 originally. I think generally speaking, you want to aim for 4, and anything above 4 is great, and anything 3 to 4 is like pretty normal. Another example of a layer that is build dependent are these 3 points right here. These 3 points equate to 5% more damage per point, and that is because of the interaction of chain with arc. 15% more damage for each remaining chain means that one more chain gives me 50% more damage on my single target. So this is actually a very solid 3 points to spend. But again, the hierarchy of the layering that you use is dependent almost exclusively on the build every single time, but there are some general things. For example, more modifiers. Universally across all builds, more modifiers will always be better than increased modifiers. To give an example of this, let's pretend that this was 10% increased cast speed versus over here, this is 10% more cast speed from Arcane Surge. The more modifier here is infinitely more valuable than the increased modifier over here, despite the cast speed magnitudes being the exact same. This is something that it transcends every build. It is true for all builds. 10% more fizz damage versus 10% increased fizz damage. The more modifier is always better. I can't remember the mathematics why. I think it's like multiplicative or some shit. Like if you have 10% increased fizz damage and you deal 100 damage, it gives you like, I don't fucking know, 3 fizz. But if you have 10% more fizz damage, it gives you 10 fizz or something like that. I forget how the math works. Who cares? That's for nerds anyway. We just doing some basic shit out here. More is better. That's all you need to know. With all that in mind, let's talk about stacking these layers together to actually produce damage. So when we're looking at Archmage Stormweaver, one of the reasons why it's so good is because it's just so many damage layers all on top of each other, right? So we have shock magnitude, we have obviously our increased damage and our base damage, we get a bunch of penetration, all of our penetration exposure comes from right here, we get chain effect over here, we grab lightning damage per 10 int, spell damage per 10 mana, we grab increased effect of Arcane Surge over here. We grab more magnitude of ailments, and then we just grab some base elemental damage increase. All of these things layer together with mana to create some of the most insane damage scaling I've ever seen. So one of the things we also do in Archmage is we stack mana. Stacking can be extremely powerful, especially when you can stack more and more weight onto a single stat. Remember, you only have so many stats available, so the more we make a singular stat more potent, the more potential that character has to produce damage. So in this case, we stack mana. So by stacking mana, we gain 1% increased effect of Arcane Surge on you per 15 max mana. So now we're scaling a more cast speed modifier and a mana regeneration rate modifier, which is just some really nice QOL. We are then over here stacking spell damage per 100% max mana. So this is going to be someone like 120% increased spell damage. We then are also stacking lightning damage per 10 int. You stack int because int produces mana, so it's relatively the same thing. This would be something that is like incidental, right? This is incidental layering because you're going to build int anyway because you need to stack mana. Int stacks mana, there you go. That would be an example of an incidental, and also a proximity layer. It's very close to everything that we're at to kind of call back to a few things, right? We take this is another just killer node over here. We're just stacking stats, stacking the intelligence to give us mana. Then on top of that, we are also using Archmage. Archmage gives us 8% of damage as extra lightning damage for each 100% maximum mana you have. This is a massive damage scaler. So not only is our mana scaling more cast speed regen and all this other stuff, it's also just giving us 8% more lightning damage for each 100% max mana we have. I will quick note, I don't actually know if this is like a true more modifier. Like, I don't know if I was dealing 100 lightning damage and then I added an Archmage and I had 100 mana, would I be dealing 108 lightning damage? I don't know if that's technically true, but it's very, very close if it's not, and it's still a hell of a lot more valuable than any sort of like increased modifier. But it is through the stacking of all these different layers on top of each other that this just creates some of the most insane damage I've literally ever seen. And on top of that, having something like Strike Twice, where now all of our shock magnitude that we get from these jewels, which are highly, highly effective points, because again, think about that damage per point. This jewel right here is literally like 14% more damage, because I think 30% equates to 6% more shock value. So it's doubled. So it's 12% more shock value. So 12% value of shock on the target, on top of giving me like 3% increased cast speed. For a single point, this is literally like, I guess like 14, 15%. This is a crazy amount of damage for a single point. And this is one of the reasons why jewels are just absolutely so busted. It's one of the reasons why this build is busted, because the fact that we can put magnitude on jewels and then just stack the shit out of it is crazy. And yeah, all of these layers in combination are why Stormweaver just becomes asinine. And I'll go over gear and gems a little bit later on, but that's just the general synopsis of like stacking damage and layering. And finally, I mentioned this earlier in the video and it's time to go over it. Let's talk about interactions. Interactions occur when two or more things work with each other to create some sort of beneficial or just some sort of output that you were looking for. They can be highly complex, they can be very simple, and then they have a wide array of benefits. They can do a ton of different things. In the case of Archmage Stormweaver, every single one of them is absolutely fucking busted. The most infamous pairing, of course, is Eldritch Battery with Everlasting Gaze. So when we take Eldritch Battery, what it does is it takes all of our base ES off of gear, converts it into mana, and then that mana is then applied through our max mana modifiers, and then it gets added to our pool, giving us a ton of mana. I mean, Eldritch Battery is literally like, I think it's like 1,000 mana or something like ridiculous. Eldritch Battery is a huge boost. Yeah, look how much mana that is. Oh my god, it's actually so much. Jesus Christ. It's literally, I don't even want to do the math. It's like 1,500 mana. It's insane. So this gives us so much base mana to work with, which then scales all of our damage. Remember all those damage modifiers talking about? This dumbass node right here just gives me 1,500 mana to make all that shit absolutely insane. But then the problem is we lose our ES from Eldritch Battery. However, because of the Everlasting Gaze, this gives us 30% of our maximum mana as extra maximum energy shield. So then what it does is it takes 30% of this pool, adds it to our ES, and then our ES is further scaled by any of percent ES modifiers that we have. The interaction between these two things gives you so much damage and so much max hit. It's absolutely fucking ridiculous. On top of that, this gives you, through the interaction of how we scale Arcane Surge from Force of Will, this gives you a ton of regen. I think my mana regen, I think if I'm walking around and I have Orb of Storms out. Oh, I'm in my manifying gear, so it's kind of shitty. But now I have 863 regen, which then applies as my actual health regen because I'm taking Mind Over Matter. Mind Over Matter is extremely potent, and it becomes even more potent from this interaction with Eldritch Battery and Everlasting Gaze. And further, because we have these two things active and our pool is so big, this then allows us to slot Chaos Inoculation to become Chaos Immune. In this game, Chaos damage is fucking retarded. So this is actually one of the most OP nodes in the game. And the fact that we can freely take this while still maintaining an effective health pool of 8,500 on a 189% rarity Magic Find setup is fucking dumb. This character is ridiculous. But again, all of these things working together is an example of how interactions can be used to create one of the single greatest dick in hand simulators I have ever played in Path of Exile. To cap off talking about interactions, stacking layers and interactions and those sorts of things, these are the primary ways that we scale power in builds. When it comes to actually putting in these layers and, introducing these interactions to a build, it's very, very similar to Matt Stone and Trey Parker talking about storyboarding in South Park. They mentioned that in between each beat or scene of an episode, the words that should fit between them are therefore or but, and you should avoid words like and then. Slightly modifying the verbiage here, it creates an excellent rule of thumb for building characters in Path of Exile. Between each of the primary build aspects of your character, so the interactions, the layers, that sort of thing, you should have words like therefore, but, and because. And you should avoid things like and then and also. For example, in my Stormweaver, I took these nodes. Therefore, I decided to stack mana. Because I am stacking mana, I took Archmage, which gives me a ton of lightning damage. Therefore, I decided to scale shock magnitude because lightning damage scales shock chance, giving me 100% shock uptime, and shock is an incidental ailment to lightning damage. Therefore, I took strike twice to give me the double value of shock magnitude by applying 2 shocks. In general, building something with that storyboarding style in mind, where everything is connected by therefore, but, or because, and avoiding just random things like, oh, and then I also got some crit over here, and I got some ailment stuff right here, and then I decided to go down and get some mana and life regen over here, right? Avoiding that sort of random, just it happens because I just thought it would be good or something. Making everything work with one another and having some form of connection will usually always result in a much stronger build than you would have otherwise. With all that yip yapping about interactions and bullshit out of the way, let's talk about defenses. With defenses, we have 4 primary layers, which are max health pool, mitigation, avoidance, and recovery. Pretty straightforward. Your max hit is how many total hit points do we have. Our mitigation is how much damage are we mitigating from the damage taken. This will be things like armor or phys taken as. Avoidance, this is anything that just outright prevents damage. So I would actually consider block an avoidance layer. Dodge is, of course, a classic avoidance layer. And then we have recovery. Recovery is going to be how do we recover the max health pool after we have taken damage. Generally speaking, when we are building out our defenses, we have 4 problems that we have to address. In no particular order, those problems are phys damage, elemental damage, chaos damage, and damage over time effects. Real quick, there is a difference between hit damage and damage over time. Things like block and dodge or avoidance layers will only fully prevent damage from hits. They will not impact damage over time. That would be something like an ignite. In order to prevent an ignite damage, or mitigate ignite damage rather, we would have to use fire res and get our cap fire res. That would mitigate the amount of ignite damage taken, but no matter how much dodge or block we have, you cannot block or dodge ignite damage. A good rule of thumb is that anything that is not a damage over time effect is a hit. This is important to understand because this means that things like armor don't actually mitigate physical damage from damage over time sources. So armor will actually not prevent bleed damage. In order to do this, we need another mitigation layer such as phys taken as. If we take 40% of phys damage taken as fire, if we took a bleed, 40% of that bleed is now taken against our fire resistance, otherwise mitigated to deal significantly less damage. Generally, when we're dealing with damage over time, recovery will usually be the primary way of dealing with it beyond mitigation layers. Going down the list, to mitigate phys damage, we usually use armor. Armor is honestly not that great though, and I actually think a way better layer, as I've mentioned multiple times, is the Cloak of Flame using phys taken as. In this case, it converts 40%, as I've already mentioned, to fire damage, which then checks 40% of that phys damage against our fire resistance. This reduces the phys damage you take by an ass ton, and it's a killer layer. Additionally, I also take in the tree catalysis, or however the fuck you say this, and this is another 5% of physical damage taken as a random element, so we're mitigating 45% of our phys damage against our elemental resistance, which is very good. We can also use evasion to just straight up avoid physical damage, which is a quite useful defensive layer, especially when you start mixing it with all the other ways to mitigate physical damage. Moving on to elemental resistance. This is going to be the go-to layer for obviously dealing with elemental damage. If you really need to stack max Ele res, you can. I don't really notice it that much, so I don't really think about it that often. Just keep your reses capped. Dealing with chaos, of course, we use chaos resistance. As I've mentioned before, we can run Chaos Inoculation, but this is not really in the scope of this character. That requires a lot of stuff to do, and you have to have a usually very high ES or mana pool or something like that to mitigate the downside of going down to 1 life. Exactly the same as damage, the more we layer our defenses and the more interactions we can find to help build them up, the infinitely more tanky our character will be. When it comes to solving defense problems, there are honestly like 101 ways to go about it. To give you a comparative example, when I'm looking at something like my Archmage Stormweaver, I'm just using a giant, massive, effective hit pool to just mitigate damage by it not being enough to actually kill me. Obviously, I have Chaos Inoculation to deal with chaos damage, and of course I have my reses capped, and I have a ton of regen to help deal with recovery. And really, the only thing I have to worry about is Fizz. And like I said, just a giant max hit pool allows you to just eat damage to the fucking mouth on this idiot ass character. The defenses on my mercenary, however, were completely different. For the longest time, I used Blasphemy, and it was actually pretty effective because it reduced the damage by everything coming at me by like, I don't know, 12% on average. And then this in combination with Catalysis and Cloak of Flame, it actually ended up being a ton of Fizz mitigation. And then I also stacked armor and evasion wherever I could. And honestly, one of the secret OP defensive layers that I didn't really talk about a whole lot is movement speed. Just moving fast and taking these nodes like right here that give me movement speed if I've killed recently, or this movement speed node over here, or this one, you just kind of run away from stuff and you don't ever really get hit a lot, really at all. So like I said, there's a lot of ways you can go about solving defenses. It's just a matter of stacking things up wherever you can. Another thing to consider when you're making a build is what utility and what quality of life does the build provide. For example, with Juggernaut and PoE 1, having access to Unstoppable meant that we could never be stunned or slowed. And goddamn, after playing PoE 2, I get hard enough to fucking jackhammer concrete thinking about the concept of walking the fuck around freely without contracting HIV in every single map. In PoE 2, it's kind of lame shit like bag space and I guess infinite mana, but whatever, it's better than nothing, I suppose. On the topic of QL, it's important to consider things too, like maybe stun threshold and ailment threshold if you really want to. These might be important to you depending on how irate it makes you that your only defense against freeze is a fucking 95 div mana stacking ring, because of course, mana stackers just really don't have enough, and the only other option is Charms, which is one of the flagship failures of a system in a game that I have ever seen. Every belt still only has one, even after buffing it. I have seen like 2 that have had 2 charm slots. So that's a giant meme. Overall, it's important to remember that while utility and quality of life is really nice to have, and it's honestly pretty important in some cases, it should be the first layer that you should get rid of if character power is not enough or it's not high enough and you need to rework some things. It sucks and it feels awful, but it's better to move a little bit slower, maybe have to use a potion to regenerate, than it is to just eat shit on every map because you're running a bleed fucking Fizz crossbow that licks my ass. Oh my Christ, with all that boring ass theory talk out of the way, we can finally actually go over doing things in game like in the passive tree. So first example, when we're talking about the passive tree, efficient pathing is going to be like the primary thing that people fuck up on all the time. Trying to avoid things like parallel lines, like for example right here, this is not indicative that you need to change something. It just means it's probably something you would look at. And realistically, if we actually look at this, if I were to slot 1 point here, which is actually pretty valuable, I could remove 1, 2, 3, 4 points and then slot 2 more and get plus 2 points. The only reason I haven't done this actually is because I am gridlocked on stats right now, but that would be an example of looking at parallel lines to create more efficient pathing, giving you more effective talent points for wheels and other important things rather than just stats. Another important aspect of your passive tree is also determined by your ascendancy, which is your starting point. I've thought about it a lot, and if I could run a Stormweaver and somehow get to the crossbow nodes down here, having Shaper of Winter and Shaper of Storms would really help me out a lot, and it makes some really cool stuff, but it's just not feasible to start here and then somehow get all the way around. You'd have to do like some edge case thing where you use Adorned or some dumb shit like that. So keep in mind where you're actually starting when you're picking your ascendancy. Another thing I'll mention about the passive tree is considering the amount of wheels at the end of your travel nodes. So for example, this is a lot of travel nodes, but by the time I actually get here, there's a lot of really good stuff and it actually becomes highly travel efficient once I've actually reached my destination. This is important to consider because maybe there's like some crazy wheel all the way out here, but if I spend 9 passive nodes or 10 passive nodes actually pathing here, and all I get is 1 wheel, and then I'm just kind of in the middle of fucking nowhere, all of those travel nodes are only being used for a single wheel. And in this case, you might consider something like an anointment. For those of you that don't know, an anointment is when you use the delirium distilled emotions to apply them to an amulet in a certain specific combination and order. In this case, I took Essence of the Storm, so I took a Greed, a Fear, a Paranoia, and then I applied it to my amulet. To do this, by the way, you just go to your delirium tab, grab an emotion, right click it, slot your amulet, put in the order in that is listed under the notable, and that is how you actually get anointments in the game. You can hold Alt over whatever notable you are looking at to see the combination. It'll show up on the bottom as well as the top right. It does say unallocated forever, but it is highlighted, so whatever that means. I think it does work. I don't actually know, but we're just going to pretend it does. Something else to consider when you're picking your points on your passive tree is the fact that everything is an exchange. So maybe I really want this wheel and it's super good, but between the wheel and all the passive points required to actually get it, it might actually just be more efficient to just grab some stuff that's nearby. Again, every time you path past something and you move somewhere, everything that you could have grabbed is exchanged for that pathing. Now, that might seem kind of obvious, but this can be really insidious at times where you might think, oh my God, this is so good. If I go over here, this is like super good. But the reality of it is, if you had taken all the travel nodes that you used to get to this wheel over here and you had just slotted them into smaller passive wheels nearby, you would have probably ended up with far more character power and far less travel node cost. Now, I will say as a quick caveat, travel nodes are not that big of a deal in PoE 2 as they are in PoE 1. In PoE 1, you really want to kind of avoid travel nodes as best as you can. Obviously, in a lot of trees, you're going to travel all the time. But in PoE 2, honestly, stats are really, really rough to solve for in this game, which is why I have like this inefficiency right here. And it's just something that's bound to happen because stats are rough. Like I said, especially if you're dual statting a character like a Witchhunter or something, it's a lot, and until you can get those rolls on gear, it's okay to expend a few inefficient points to travel a little bit more just to cover your stat base. I mean, I literally am going to get rid of all of this, and there's nothing I can do right now. I have to have it. The last few things I'll mention about the passive tree is that damage early on is going to be probably the most important thing you should spend your points on. The reality of it is in campaign, you can probably just solve your defenses by just getting some life and some res on some gear. You really don't need anything crazy like a bunch of evasion layers or catalysis or whatever, anything like that. You just kind of need some basic stuff, but the thing you really want is damage. One of the most overlooked things in PoE, both 1 and 2, that people forget is that one of the best defensive layers is your offensive layer. And a common pitfall that people mistake all the time is that they think that because they're dying so much, I need to get more defensives. I need to be way more defensive, way more tanky. I'm dying way too much. So what they end up doing is they end up taking out a bunch of damage and going into a bunch of tankiness, and they actually end up creating a character that is less tanky than they were before. The reason being is that they're just not killing anything, and the amount of incoming damage has literally tripled while their tankiness has only doubled. Damage and defense play this like counterbalancing role when it comes to the survivability of your character, and it cannot be understated how important it is that just simply killing everything on the map before it even has the chance to attack you is one of, if not the most premier defensive layer in the game. The last thing that I'll mention with the talent tree is, I've already talked about it before, but it's jewel sockets. Keep these in mind. These can really help you out in a pinch. They're always worth it. Like no matter what, they are always worth the point every time because they're just so versatile and they can do so many things. You can get QOL from here. You can get utility from these. You can get damage. You can get recovery. Like you can just get a lot of things from jewels. So bear that in mind. One of my favorite uses for jewels, I don't have any on this guy because this character is literally the most broke bare bones bitch I've ever had in my entire life. But one of the best jewels to get is recovery on kill. Life on kill on a map will just do wonders for your survivability while mapping. Moving on to gearing, one of the most important parts when it comes to gearing a character is understanding the amount of suffix efficiency that an item has. And that's just a fancy way of saying how much suffix stat does this item give me, and it's usually by slot. So a lot of times if a single slot has like 100 plus total resistance, it's usually going to be a very good item, and it's usually going to be something that you want to plan for. So one of the reasons why I really like this build is because with like the 3 dragons, you can get a 20 to all res roll, and then I can double slot it with a corruption and get 30 to all res, giving me 90 total resistance from a unique slot. This is really good for uniques because usually the price you pay for taking power from a unique is that it doesn't offer you fuck all in terms of suffixes. And remember, suffixes are generally going to be the most important stat that you're thinking about. And the reason for that is because every single character needs the same 3 suffixes. You must cap your resistances, period, no matter what. Everything else is a crapshoot depending on the build, and this is why I try to think in total res pretty much the entire time. And when I say plan for it, whenever we're slotting uniques in the build, the general assumption is that they're not going to give you any suffix stat, and that needs to be made up elsewhere, meaning that you're going to need a few pieces here and there that are highly suffix efficient, that offer a ton of total resistances to make up for the fact that you have a slot that has none. You can think of this, it's called suffix pressure. So suffix pressure is how many total suffixes do I have available on my gear versus how many do I need. The more suffix efficient items are, the less and less suffix pressure I have to deal with my gearing. And that means I can usually get better suffix stats, things like attack speed and cast speed and crit, or I can just get cheaper items in general. A pair of boots that has 35% movement speed as well as tri-res is significantly more expensive than a pair of boots with just a single res on it. Also, I can use this, and this is especially important in PoE 2, to solve for stats and getting stat rolls on my other gear so I can free up a ton of my passive points that I have kind of sitting here more or less being wasted right now. In general, just considering total resistance when you're gearing is probably a good practice. A lot of people think that you just need to hit 75 and then you're done, but the reality of it is it's okay to overcap res a little bit, especially if you're getting like an item that is just like super resistance heavy and it has everything you need. There's nothing wrong with that. The more total res you have, generally speaking, the easier it is to swap your gear around, because instead of having to buy like 3 pieces of gear because you're totally gridlocked on res, you can just, swap one out. The other item will cover the amount of res that you're missing, that sort of thing. And again, I'll mention this, you don't have to be at like 110 or whatever, because if you get 25 monster pen as Ellie and you get Curse of Ellie weakness, it's like minus 40 res in total. You don't have to be at 110. I mean, hell, you can probably stop at 75. It's just fine. It's just a thing to think about, that if an item has a bunch of extra res on it, it's probably okay, and it will probably be pretty useful that it has those things later on in the future when you're swapping around gear. The next thing that I'll mention for gearing is your weapon, and particularly for attack builds. What a lot of players who are playing an attack build don't understand is that your weapon accounts for such an enormous percentage of your total damage dealt with your attack skill. Keeping it current and up to date as much as you can is by far the most important thing you can do to keep your damage up while you're progressing through your character. This is where it's really important to actually read the fucking skill that you use, because it will kind of determine what you're looking for on your weapon. So in my case, I know it converts 40% of fizz damage to lightning, so I just want to stack a bunch of fizz, and this is how all these other attack skills work. They all just convert fizz to an element. So the more fizz I have on my weapon, the more that all of this stuff does. And in this case, I'm not really too concerned with attack speed because I have to reload my bolts constantly. So I actually focus more on the physical damage range rather than the actual physical DPS. And that will change depending on the build that you're playing, of course. For casters, as sure as the sky is blue, I swear to God, a one-handed weapon plus a shield is literally better in every single case scenario for whatever reason. I'm sure there are instances where that isn't true, but if I had $1 for every fucking time a staff was better than a wand plus a shield, I would have as many dollars as I have now, which is fucking zero. I would bet my ass for most casters with staves right now, if you found a comparable shield in one hand, your build would just immediately start performing better for reasons. I have no idea why. It's always better. I don't know. When it comes to selecting uniques in a build, this can actually be quite difficult, especially in the current state of PoE 2, where every unique is literally fucking worthless clanker trash, or it's 300 divine, and there are like very few in betweens. The only real advice I could give is just look out for keywords and key phrases on uniques that are relative to your build and maybe read them over, but that's really kind of all you have. Hopefully, sometime in the near future, PoE Ninja will actually account for PoE 2, and then we can actually start looking at characters who are the same ascendancy, using the same skill, who are doing similar builds to you. This is an absolute godsend when it comes to figuring out how to build something, because a lot of times not a lot of times, every single time there's always someone better than you doing what you're doing, and looking at what they do can be very helpful, especially when you're trying to theory craft something or you don't really know a lot of the uniques in the game. Hopefully that becomes available for PoE 2 sometime in the near future. The last thing that I'll mention when it comes to gearing is when you should actually upgrade your character. The general indicator for this is going to be the smoothness of your progression. And if you pay attention to this, it's very obvious once you are actually looking at it. What I mean by this is when you are progressing through campaign or the maps, or whatever it is that you're doing, you will start to notice when your damage starts to dip. right? Like if you start shitting on stuff, it will be very clear and obvious when your damage is starting to slowly lack a little bit more and more and you're not really keeping up. Or maybe you're taking a little bit more damage than you're used to, having a few more close calls, maybe even dying here and there. Those are general indicators that it's time to go to the trade website and get absolutely scammed the fuck out for some stinky shit item that is literally 800% of its value because Fubgun can't stop MFing fucking Breach. Just as important as your gear and everything else are your skills. The skills that you use and the combinations you create can make so much of a difference, and you can quite literally make something out of nothing with the character by just moving some supports around, coming up with some combinations and that sorts of thing. Looking for combinations and trying to figure out what skills to use, this is pretty simple, and honestly the best way is literally just type in something that you need. I need lightning, and then you can do all gems, and now you see we have access to everything that is lightning. We can kind of read through this, maybe figure it out. Maybe you're a fizz guy and we just type in fizz, see what we have available. This sort of methodology is really important to use, and it's important to use this not just for skill gems, but also for supports as well. The combination of these things cannot be understated in terms of the power that it can produce. I literally was some frag rounding fucking retard with some shit ass bleed on this character, and by sitting there and swapping some things around and coming up with some combos, I brought him from the depths. And that was on a Witchhunter. Every other class has so many buttons and so many different combinations. Stormweaver literally has like 9 different useful abilities at any given time. For Witchhunter, we have shoot and we have reload. And that's it. We just walk around the map shooting and reloading. That's all we got. And God help you if you're a fizz damage witch hunter, because all you have available are banner skills, which, by the way, thank God they brought those back. When my girlfriend comes in and wants to go to an indoor water park, I'm actually fucking paralyzed with indecision between the ideas of getting pissed drunk on a lazy river or dropping a fucking post with a bed sheet on it in the middle of Valve Factory so I can move faster in a tiny circle. Because one of those things for sure isn't a step towards the edge of a fucking bridge. Anyways, in PoE 2, skill comboing is really a huge deal, and it can add a ton of damage to your build. And I mean, in some cases, they're like 200 to 300% more if you just press your buttons. Coming back to Stormweaver, because again, they have everything. If I drop Orb of Storms twice, and then I press Mana Tempest and curse the target, as well if I had a Chiming Staff too to give me Sigil of Power, pressing all those buttons is literally like 200% more damage. And if I really, really want to ramp it up, I can do all those things again and then hit Lightning Conduit. And if I have two 84% shocks on the target, that will usually one-shot literally anything. It does so much damage. Comboing is not only useful for dealing damage, it's also really useful for things like utility and quality of life. For example, on the Stormweaver, yet again, if I throw out Ball Lightning, I can Lightning Warp to it, and this allows me to cross over gaps in terrain. This allows me to offensively use Lightning Warp and just obliterate a bunch of shit, tele-stomping it, that sort of thing. You have a ton of utility in your extra buttons, and just some of the supports can be quite valuable as well. So in Lightning Conduit, or not Lightning Conduit, excuse me, in Lightning Warp, having Soul Drain, so every time I cull something with Lightning Warp, it just gives me mana regen. There are a ton of little things like this. Honestly, with Arc, I run Shock Siphon as well. Shock Siphon is really nice for in-map sustain from that percentage kill. The life version of this is Cannibalism. That is also super useful. Anytime you have percent on kill, it really does help with your map sustain a ton. The point is that overall, there's just so many combinations and so many things that you can do regarding your skills and your supports. The number one thing I can tell you is that you need to experiment. You need to move things around, test it, go over here, try that, move your passive tree, assuming you have the money, obviously. And just do anything you can to really experiment with the build that you're producing. I truly can't overstate it. The value of experimenting is honestly immeasurable. My Witch Hunter went from the absolute depths of the character where I was considering like, holy fuck, what was I even doing? Like, this is never going to work, to becoming the thing that you see on the screen now, just absolutely shitting on everything. That took hours of experimenting. I probably swapped my support gems around at least 50 times, moved a bunch of gems, respec a bunch of times. It's just the price of doing business in a game like this. And no, before anyone says anything, this character is not pumped full of divines or anything like that. This is a totally budget character. I took a 50x loan from a friend of mine and then farmed it back and made like 3 div over the course of a few hours. It was brutal as fuck, to be honest. And then I got what you see in front of you. With all that said and done, boys, I believe that is the end of this video. It is 8 a.m. now, at the time of recording. I started this at, I think it was 7 p.m. the day prior. So I have been up for 13 hours. I've been doing this for 13 hours straight, making this motherfucker. Thank God it is over. I appreciate everyone for watching. I have the Stormweaver guide coming out. I actually am going to do a quick little build diary on this Witchhunter because he is like my new favorite character. But yeah, those two things will be coming out in the near future, and I'll probably start doing some short stuff here as well. But until then, I will see you guys later. Deuces.